A woman is trapped on a bus full of terrified people. Enemy soldiers are close enough to hear a child cry. Hawkeye Pierce remembers begging the woman to keep her chicken quiet. He can describe the bus, he can describe the darkness, he can describe the sound. But sitting in an army psychiatric hospital, the funniest doctor on television cannot say what really happened. For 11 seasons, Hawkeye used jokes to survive a war he despised. In the final episode, the joke stops protecting him. That memory became the darkest turn in the most watched series finale in American television history. But it only worked because viewers had spent 11 years watching a lightweight military comedy become something much harder to define. MASH survived weak ratings, network anxiety, the loss of leading actors, a rotating creative team, and the dangerous belief that a successful show should never change. Every time it appeared to lose an essential piece, it rebuilt itself into something deeper. And one of those changes began with a departure so secret that most of the cast discovered it only moments before the cameras rolled. It produced a minute of television that permanently changed what a sitcom was allowed to do. To understand why the final goodbye reached more than 100 million people, we have to rewind to the moment when almost nobody was watching. The story starts before television, with a surgeon who had already seen the real version. H. Richard Hornberger served in a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War. Writing under the name Richard Hooker, he turned those experiences into the 1968 novel MASH, a novel about 3 army doctors. The book followed gifted surgeons coping with exhaustion, military absurdity, and trauma through pranks, drinking, defiance, and a sense of humor sharp enough to cut through army regulations. Robert Altman directed the film adaptation released in 1970. It was anarchic, profane, messy, and proudly hostile to authority. The war on screen was Korea, but audiences living through Vietnam understood the target. The film became a major success and won an Academy Award for its screenplay. It also created a problem for anyone hoping to adapt it for network television. The movie's identity depended on things CBS could not air, and its cruelty could be as important as its comedy. Producer Gene Reynolds believed the premise could work on television. He brought in Larry Gelbart, a comedy writer whose experience ranged from radio to Broadway. Gelbart did not simply clean up the film. He found a new governing idea. The doctors could be irreverent without the series becoming indifferent. The operating room would remind viewers that beneath every gag was a body the surgeons were desperately trying to save. Gelbart later described the tone as comedy written in a minor key. That phrase explains almost everything MASH would become. The jokes were bright, but the note underneath them never stopped hurting. The original television ensemble was built around Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, played by Alan Alda. Hawkeye was an exceptional surgeon, an enemy of empty authority, an enthusiastic drinker, a relentless flirt, and a man whose fast mouth often moved before his judgment. Alda initially worried that the womanizing made Hawkeye feel unlike him. What gave the character weight was the reason behind the performance. Hawkeye was not joking because war amused him. He was joking because taking the war at face value might destroy him. Wayne Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's closest partner in surgery and rebellion. McLean Stevenson was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the camp commander who could be indecisive, distracted, and hilariously unmilitary while remaining a capable doctor. Gary Berghoff returned from the film as Radar O'Reilly, the clerk who seemed to hear helicopters before anyone else and quietly kept the entire 4077th functioning. On the other side of the camp's social war were Major Frank Burns and Major Margaret Houlihan. Larry Linville made Frank rigid, jealous, hypocritical, and astonishingly easy to provoke. Loretta Swit's Margaret was the head nurse, disciplined, ambitious, clinically excellent, and initially tied to Frank by romance and their shared devotion to military order. Father Mulcahy, played primarily by William Christopher, and Jamie Farr's Maxwell Klinger, gradually grew from supporting comic figures into the emotional fabric of the camp. The premise was simple enough for a weekly comedy. Wounded soldiers arrived, the doctors operated. Between emergencies, Hawkeye and Trapper fought boredom, officers, and Frank Burns. But CBS distrusted one of the most important tonal choices. The producers did not want a laugh track. The network did. A compromise kept canned laughter away from the operating room scenes, creating a boundary viewers could feel, even when they did not consciously notice it. Outside surgery, the audience might be told when to laugh. Inside, the sound dropped away and the consequences became real. That tension was visible from the beginning, but the first season struggled to find an audience. MASH finished 46th among 75 network series. By ordinary television logic, that might have been the end. The reviews and Emmy nominations suggested something stronger was present, and CBS gave it another chance in a far better Saturday night position beside All in the Family. The second season broke through. Success solved the ratings problem. It created a more dangerous one. Now MASH had to decide whether it was a successful comedy set near a war or a series actually willing to follow the damage home. The early episodes could be broad, fast, and unruly. Hawkeye and Trapper schemed against Frank. Henry struggled to command people he often agreed with. Klinger wore increasingly elaborate dresses in the hope that the army would declare him unfit for service. The public address system delivered cheerful absurdities while helicopters brought casualties over the hills. That public address system became one of the show's smartest tools. It could announce an incoming wave of wounded men and seconds later offer a ridiculous movie, a missing piece of laundry, or an army instruction nobody could possibly obey. The voice did not distinguish catastrophe from administration. That was the joke, but it was also the institution in miniature. The army could turn anything into another item on a list. The camp itself developed a recognizable daily rhythm. The swamp was part bedroom, part bar, part argument chamber, and part refuge. Hawkeye and Trapper's homemade still produced alcohol of uncertain quality and conversations of even less restraint. The mess tent turned hunger into complaint. Rosie's bar provided a fragile civilian edge to a military world. The operating room remained the place where status games stopped because skill mattered more than rank. Recurring letters home let the series reorganize those spaces around a single point of view. Dear Dad episodes allowed Hawkeye to narrate camp life to his father, making the audience another person receiving news from Korea. The device could move quickly between jokes and surgery because a letter naturally gathers fragments. It also established Crabapple Cove as an emotional destination long before viewers needed to imagine Hawkeye returning there. Klinger was initially designed for a single appearance, but Jamie Fair made the character impossible to discard. His dresses were not presented as a private identity. They were evidence in a campaign for a psychiatric discharge. The comic engine was Klinger's absolute confidence that the next outfit, stunt, or invented symptom might finally persuade the army. The deeper joke was catch-22 logic. Anyone calculating enough to fake insanity for survival might be too rational to qualify as insane. Father Mulcahy grew more quietly. He had no authority over surgery or command, and the jokes sometimes placed him outside the camp's sexual and alcoholic culture. But the character became the person most willing to sit beside suffering that could not be repaired. His faith was tested less by abstract debate than by usefulness. When casualties arrived, could he comfort someone, donate blood, assist a procedure, or simply remain present? William Christopher made gentleness active rather than decorative, but the writers kept looking for stories beneath the machinery of a sitcom. Gelbart and the team drew on interviews with more than 50 people who had served as medical personnel and soldiers in Korea and Vietnam. That research gave the comedy a reservoir of lived contradiction, boredom interrupted by terror, precision performed under impossible pressure, and people forming intense families with strangers because tomorrow was never guaranteed. The episode, Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, gave Hawkeye a personal loss he could not joke away. A childhood friend arrived at the camp as a wounded soldier and died on the operating table. The death did not happen to an anonymous patient who could vanish when the episode ended. It reached directly into Hawkeye's life before Korea. Henry's response was blunt. There was no rule saying young men could not die. The episode showed what the series could do when it let humor carry viewers close to pain and then removed the floor. Other stories pushed at race, religion, mental strain, homophobia, and the moral compromises created by war. They did not always age perfectly. Some early stereotypes and sexual politics remain uncomfortable. The show was changing while the culture around it changed, and that unevenness is part of its story. What mattered was the direction of travel. Characters who began as types were increasingly allowed memory, contradiction, and consequence. The Season 2 episode George confronted the Army's treatment of a gay soldier at a time when network television rarely allowed such a character to appear with sympathy. Hawkeye and Trapper protected a decorated patient from Frank's attempt to report him. The episode still carries the language and assumptions of its period, but its moral alignment is unusually clear. The soldier's sexuality is not the sickness. The institution's prejudice is. The incubator used a simpler comic machine. The doctors needed equipment that could save lives, but the Army's supply system could provide pizza ovens, paperwork, and explanations more easily than an incubator. Hawkeye and Trapper moved through layers of authority while the request became more absurd. Nothing supernatural happened. The comedy came from watching a rational need collide with a system designed to protect its own process, and OR spent most of its running time in surgery after casualties overwhelmed the unit. Personal disputes dissolved into concentration. Frank, Margaret, Henry, Hawkeye, Trapper, the nurses, and the corpsmen became parts of one exhausted organism. When the pressure finally eased, the episode did not pretend the experience had been ennobling. The point was competence under strain and the temporary intimacy created by keeping strangers alive. Margaret Houlihan became the clearest example. In the film and early television episodes, hot lips could function as a nickname, a punchline, and a way of reducing an accomplished officer to her sexuality. Loretta Swit pushed for something fuller. Margaret remained demanding and proud of her rank, but the series began treating those qualities as parts of a serious person rather than proof that she deserved humiliation. Her romantic attachment to Frank weakened. Her professional authority strengthened. Experiences accumulated instead of disappearing at the end of every episode. The series was learning continuity of character even when its plots reset each week. That growth made viewers care about the people behind the routines. And at the end of season 3, the show used that trust against them. McLean Stevenson decided to leave. The writers could have transferred Henry Blake to another post, preserving the possibility of a guest appearance or return. Instead, they gave him what first looked like a warm television farewell. Henry received his discharge. The camp celebrated. Radar struggled through a goodbye. Henry left Korea in civilian clothes, carrying the promise that his wife and children were waiting in Illinois. The episode could have ended there, with the audience sad but safe. It did not. In the operating room, Radar entered without a mask. He read a message reporting that Henry's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan. There were no survivors. Then the surgeons went back to work. The final page had been kept from most of the cast. The actors were given the news shortly before filming, which helped produce the shock visible in the room. A dropped surgical instrument made the final cut. The scene did not offer a speech, a music swell, or time for grief. Casualty arrived as information, and duty continued because another patient was already open on the table. For viewers accustomed to comedies restoring order before the credits, Henry Blake's death felt like a violation. That was precisely the point. War did not respect the emotional contract of a sitcom. A man could complete his service, say goodbye, and still fail to reach home. The scene became a landmark, but the production was facing an even larger problem than viewers realized. Wayne Rogers also left. There would be no Trapper farewell episode, no final scene between the two captains, and no clean handoff. When season 4 began, MASH had lost its commanding officer and one of its 2 central surgeons at the same time. Miniseries respond to that kind of damage by manufacturing replacements who imitate the people audiences already loved. MASH made the opposite choice, and that decision gave it a second life. Captain B.J. Hunnicutt, played by Mike Farrell, arrived as a skilled surgeon from Mill Valley, California. Like Trapper, he became Hawkeye's closest friend. But B.J. was not Trapper with a new face. He was married to Peg, devoted to his daughter Erin, and emotionally anchored to a home that continued without him. Every letter reminded him that his child was growing while he was trapped in Korea. His humor could be mischievous, but his pain came from separation rather than the absence of attachment. That difference changed Hawkeye. With Trapper, rebellion often felt like 2 boys escalating a prank. With BJ, the friendship had more room for disagreement, resentment, and moral challenge. They could love each other and still wound each other. The relationship became less frictionless and therefore more durable. Colonel Sherman Potter, played by Harry Morgan, replaced Henry Blake as commander. Potter was regular Army, experienced, decisive, and unimpressed by theatrical defiance. Again, the writers refused to copy the old chemistry. Hawkeye could not manipulate Potter as easily as Henry. Potter also did not exist merely to stop the fun. He understood that unconventional surgeons might require unconventional leadership. He could enforce discipline, recognize trauma, and join the camp's jokes without surrendering authority. Potter brought something the original camp did not have, an adult whom the younger characters could respect without becoming obedient caricatures. His marriage to Mildred gave him a life beyond the Army. His memories of earlier wars gave the Korean conflict a longer historical shadow. He knew the institution from the inside and still recognized its absurdity. The season 4 premiere turned the reset into story. Hawkeye raced to find Trapper and missed him. There was no proper goodbye. On the journey back with BJ, the new partnership formed under pressure rather than by announcement. At the camp, Potter's arrival redrew the chain of command. The show acknowledged the absences instead of pretending nothing had changed. BJ's arrival also changed the meaning of home. Trapper had a family in the background, but his television identity was largely contained inside Korea. Peg and Aaron were central to BJ even when they never appeared. A letter about a first word, a birthday, or another man helping with a household problem could destabilize him more completely than an officer's threat. Korea was not only dangerous because BJ might die there, it was dangerous because life at home might learn to continue without him. That fear occasionally made BJ less likable, which was valuable. He could judge Hawkeye and then fail his own standards. He could become possessive, self-righteous, or furious at a person who had done nothing more than remind him what he was missing. The show allowed devotion to contain resentment. A faithful husband separated by war was not automatically a calm or simple man. Potter's stability had its own price. He had served in earlier conflicts and carried a longer roll call of absent friends. In Old Soldiers, a bottle sent by a dying friend led Potter to gather the camp and explain a private tradition among men who had survived the First World War together. He drank to friends who were now gone. The scene gave Harry Morgan room to show that the Colonel's strength did not come from being untouched. It came from having practiced grief for decades. This was the first great survival lesson of MASH. Replacement works when the new character creates new stories. BJ's family opened emotional territory Trapper could not. Potter's competence forced different forms of rebellion. The ensemble did not heal by restoring the past. It healed by building a different future. But one member of the original opposition was becoming trapped by the very role that made him funny. Frank Burns could lose every argument, misunderstand every moral choice, and return unchanged the following week. As everyone around him became more human, his limitations grew harder to hide. Margaret's development accelerated the problem. She became engaged to Lieutenant Colonel Donald Penobscot, breaking the affair with Frank and giving Swit material outside the old romantic triangle. Frank's response was comic desperation, but the story also exposed how dependent his role had been on Margaret remaining frozen beside him. Larry Linville was a skilled actor and, by accounts from colleagues, far warmer than the character audiences loved to hate. He understood that Frank had reached the edge of what the writers could plausibly do. After 5 seasons, Linville left. The series again resisted duplication. Major Charles Emerson Winchester III entered as Frank's replacement in season 6, but the resemblance ended with rank and conflict. David Ogden Stiers played Winchester as a brilliant Boston surgeon with wealth, education, cultivated taste, and an ego large enough to occupy its own tent. Unlike Frank, Charles could match Hawkeye and BJ in the operating room. They could mock his snobbery, but they could not dismiss his talent. That competence transformed the dramatic balance. Charles was an antagonist who could be right. His arrogance concealed loyalty, shame, generosity, and deep feeling. An episode might begin with him protecting privilege and end with him privately helping someone he had publicly belittled. The writers no longer needed a fool on the opposite side. They had a peer whose values collided with the camp's culture. The replacement pattern was now complete. Potter was not Henry, BJ was not Trapper, Winchester was not Frank. Each new character altered the series' emotional geometry. Instead of surviving cast turnover, MASH used turnover to mature. Winchester's best stories exploited the distance between his social armor and his medical conscience. He could complain about living conditions, protect his record collection like sacred property, and treat camp life as an insult imposed on Boston. But when a patient's future depended on him, class performance often gave way to precision and responsibility. In one story, Charles secretly donated chocolates to an orphanage, only to become furious when the administrator traded them for basic food. His anger assumed the gift's symbolic meaning mattered most. The explanation that rice and cabbage would feed children longer forced him to recognize that generosity on the giver's terms could become vanity. In another, his relationship with a pianist who had lost the use of one hand turned technical rehabilitation into a question of identity. Charles understood that losing a form of excellence could feel like losing the self. These stories would have been impossible with Frank. That does not make one character morally better as a piece of comedy. It shows why the series had to change its source of conflict. A longer-running MASH needed opponents capable of transformation, including Hawkeye himself. The same principle was changing Margaret. Her marriage to Donald failed. Rather than pushing her back into Frank's arms or reducing the divorce to a joke, the series let her confront loneliness, ambition, desire, and the cost of building an identity around male approval. She could be unreasonable and vulnerable, formidable and frightened. The camp increasingly called her Margaret because Loretta Swit had helped make the old label too small. Creative leadership was changing as well. Larry Gelbart departed after season 4. Gene Reynolds later stepped away from the daily production. Alan Alda became increasingly important as a writer and director in addition to playing Hawkeye. That evolution has sometimes been flattened into the claim that the show simply became the Alan Alda Show. Jamie Fair described Alda as the spine of the series, but also emphasized his generosity and the effort to feed every member of the ensemble. The tonal shift was real. The later seasons used less aggressive canned laughter and spent more time on moral arguments, marriage, exhaustion, and psychological injury. Some viewers preferred the faster, wilder early years. Others believed the later period gave the show its enduring depth. The useful question is not which half was the real MASH. The show lasted because both halves shared the same minor key. The debate often focuses on Hawkeye because his voice became so prominent. He could identify hypocrisy with exhilarating clarity, but certainty was also one of his flaws. Episodes placed him in command and showed that condemning decisions was easier than making them. His refusal to carry a weapon expressed a coherent moral boundary, yet the camp still depended on soldiers and systems he despised. The show did not always challenge him enough, but its strongest later stories understood that righteous anger can become another way of controlling a room. Margaret increasingly challenged that control. She could share Hawkeye's contempt for stupidity without sharing his contempt for the army. Her profession, rank, and ambition were not temporary obstacles she had to abandon before becoming sympathetic. The nurses exposed the isolation created by her authority and by the distance she maintained from the women under her command. When that distance finally broke, the episode did not erase rank. It let Margaret admit that leadership had cost her belonging. The relationship between Hawkeye and Margaret therefore became more interesting as the simple opposition weakened. They could be attracted to each other, infuriated by each other, and capable of recognizing the seriousness beneath the other's performance. Their long night together in Comrades in Arms was not a secret answer to the series. It was another test of what intimacy means when fear compresses time. Once the immediate danger passed, the differences remained. Early MASH often used comedy to interrupt war. Later MASH more often asked what the interruption cost. Hawkeye's speeches grew longer, BJ's homesickness became sharper, Potter's steadiness acquired grief. Margaret's ambition had consequences. Charles's refinement could not insulate him from loss, and the series began experimenting with form, as though the ordinary sitcom frame could no longer contain everything the camp had accumulated. The Interview, written by Gelbart, presented the characters in black and white as if a documentary crew had visited the 4077. Questions arrived from an unseen interviewer. The characters answered in fragments, jokes, pauses, and sudden honesty. The format stripped away conventional plotting and let performance carry the episode. It also made the fictional doctors feel like people giving testimony. Point of view showed the camp through the eyes of a wounded soldier. The camera became the patient. Familiar characters leaned into frame, discussed his injuries, and continued their lives around a body that could not answer. The technique changed the viewer's relationship to the recurring operating room rhythm. We were no longer watching casualties arrive. For a half hour, we were one of them. Lifetime placed a clock on screen and followed an emergency in near real time. A wounded soldier needed an arterial graft before paralysis became permanent. The ticking device was more than a novelty. It turned the surgical urgency that normally happened between jokes into the episode's visible structure. Dreams entered the sleeping minds of exhausted camp members, using symbolic images to expose fears that ordinary dialogue could not. The episode divided viewers, but its ambition was unmistakable. A network comedy about army doctors had become a place where surrealism, documentary language, theatrical monologue, and psychological horror could coexist with practical jokes. The experiments worked because the setting remained stable. The signpost, the swamp, Rosie's bar, the operating room, and the public address speaker became a geography viewers knew as well as the characters did. Formal Risk felt legible because home base was familiar. Then the camp lost the person who had quietly made that familiarity function. Radar began as an almost magical clerk. He anticipated orders, heard aircraft before anyone else, and translated Henry's confusion into action. Under Potter, he remained essential, but the innocence of the character became harder for Gary Berghoff to sustain. Radar had grown while the actor had grown in a different direction. Berghoff wanted more time with his family and eventually left the series. Goodbye Radar gave the departure space. Radar received a hardship discharge after the death of his uncle left the family farm without him. A farewell celebration was planned, but wounded soldiers arrived and the party disappeared into work. Once again, MASH refused the clean goodbye its characters wanted. Radar left his teddy bear behind. The object had long symbolized the youth the Army had placed inside a war zone. When Hawkeye found it, the camp was not merely losing a clerk. It was losing the illusion that some part of itself could remain untouched. Klinger moved into the company clerk role. That transition completed another long character journey. The dresses had been a campaign to escape the Army, but Jamie Fair and the writers had gradually built Klinger into a resourceful, loyal Toledo native whose imagination served the camp rather than only himself. When he stopped wearing dresses regularly, it was not because the joke had been declared shameful. The character no longer needed one visual premise to justify his presence. By the final years, the 4077th was an ensemble built almost equally from originals and replacements. Hawkeye, Margaret, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy carried the early history. BJ, Potter, and Winchester embodied the second era. Their shared experience made the distinction matter less with every season. The camp's supporting population mattered too. Nurses such as Kelly, recurring enlisted men, cooks, drivers, visiting officers, local civilians, and Sidney Friedman made the world feel larger than the names in the opening credits. Sidney was especially important because he treated psychological injury without behaving as though sanity were a permanent category. People moved toward and away from crisis. He listened to jokes without assuming laughter meant health. That understanding allowed the series to depict different forms of breakdown. Hawkeye's sleeplessness, anger, compulsive joking, and periodic collapse were not one continuous diagnosis neatly named for the audience. They were signs that his defenses required more energy every year. BJ's pain appeared through jealousy and rage. Charles withdrew into superiority. Margaret tightened control. Potter relied on ritual and duty. Klinger converted anxiety into schemes. The ensemble became a catalog of survival strategies. This created the final challenge. The real Korean War lasted 3 years. MASH had been on television for more than a decade. The actors had visibly aged inside a story where time could not move normally. The series could continue producing strong episodes, but the characters' inability to leave was beginning to become the subject. The later stories repeatedly asked what home meant after Korea had changed them. BJ feared missing his daughter's childhood. Potter imagined retirement with Mildred while knowing command had become part of him. Margaret wondered whether professional ambition and intimacy could coexist. Charles clung to Boston as proof that the war could not redefine him. Klinger had spent years trying to escape Korea, yet Korea had become the place where his competence was most visible. Hawkeye had the weakest picture of home. Crabapple Cove, Maine, and his father waited there, but his adult identity had been forged at the 4077th. The jokes, the romances, the moral speeches, and the refusal to carry a gun all protected a self constructed in opposition to war. If the war ended, what happened to the machinery he used to survive it? The cast and producers chose to finish after season 11. Not everyone wanted the same thing, but the decision allowed the series to construct an ending rather than simply stop. The final episode would be a 2.5-hour television movie, co-written by 9 writers and directed by Alan Alda. Production itself delivered one final crisis. A brush fire swept through the Malibu exterior location and destroyed much of the set. The damage was incorporated into the story as an enemy incendiary attack that forced the 4077th to evacuate. A real ending consumed the physical camp, while the fictional ending dismantled the community. The finale was filmed before the last regular episode aired, partly to manage schedules and protect details. It did not begin with victory. It began with Hawkeye in a psychiatric hospital under the care of Dr. Sidney Friedman. Now the bus memory returned. Hawkeye remembered civilians and medical personnel hiding from an enemy patrol. A woman held something that would not stay quiet. In his first telling, it was a chicken. He had insisted she silence it or expose everyone on the bus. Sydney kept returning to the story because the emotion did not fit the words. The truth finally broke through. It had not been a chicken. It had been the woman's baby. Under the pressure of Hawkeye's demand, she smothered the child to save the others. The reveal was devastating because it turned Hawkeye's greatest defense against war against him. He had converted an unbearable human memory into an absurd image. The man who used jokes to tell the truth had used one final joke to hide it from himself. This was the cliffhanger embedded in the entire series. How long could a person translate horror into comedy before the translation failed? The answer was not that Hawkeye had been weak. The answer was that no defense lasts forever. The finale gave each character a separate confrontation with leaving. BJ received orders to go home, departed, and was sent back after the orders were canceled. His inability to give Hawkeye a proper goodbye reopened the wound left by Trapper's silent departure. The series had spent years teaching these men to speak through jokes. Now it demanded plain language from them, and BJ resisted the word. Margaret chose a stateside hospital rather than another glamorous overseas post. Potter prepared to return to Mildred. Father Mulcahy suffered hearing damage after an explosion and faced a future in which the music and voices central to his calling might never sound the same. Klinger, the man who had tried everything to leave Korea, decided to remain while helping Soon Lee search for her family. Charles experienced one of the finale's most painful reversals. He taught captured Chinese musicians to play Mozart, finding beauty and intellectual kinship in the middle of collapse. After a prisoner exchange, he learned that most of them had been killed. Music, his refuge and proof of civilization, now carried the memory of their deaths. Home would not restore it to innocence. The war officially ended. The public address announcement that had introduced emergencies now delivered peace. But peace did not reset the characters to who they had been in Season 1. The finale understood that going home and becoming whole were different events. The farewells arrived one by one. Potter saluted his people and rode away. Margaret and Hawkeye shared a goodbye that held 11 years of conflict, attraction, growth, and respect. Charles left with his dignity and grief. Klinger remained behind in a suit, finally staying by choice. Then Hawkeye and BJ reached the final hill. Hawkeye wanted BJ to say goodbye. BJ still could not make the word behave like an ordinary word. They separated, Hawkeye lifting off in a helicopter while BJ rode away below. On the ground, spelled in stones large enough to be seen from the air, was the answer: goodbye. The gesture paid off more than one friendship. Trapper had left without a note. Henry had left with a celebration and never reached home. Radar's party had been interrupted. BJ's first attempt to depart had happened while Hawkeye was away. Across 11 seasons, MASH repeatedly denied its people the clean exits television normally guarantees. The final word was enormous because the series knew how difficult saying it had become. When Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen aired on February 28, 1983, more than 100 million viewers watched. It remains the most watched series finale and the most watched episode of a scripted television series in the United States. The scale is astonishing, but the achievement is not merely statistical. The finale asked a mass audience to spend an evening with trauma, grief, damaged friendship, and the uncertain work of returning home. MASH continued through reruns, syndication, home video, reunions, museum collections, and generations that encountered the Korean War by first recognizing the 4077th. Its influence can be seen in later dramedies that move between absurdity and pain without warning. It demonstrated that a comedy could treat laughter as behavior rather than decoration. People joke at funerals, in hospitals, during disasters, and in war, not because suffering is funny, but because human beings need a small place where suffering does not control every breath. The immediate attempts to extend the world showed how difficult its balance was to reproduce. After MASH followed Potter, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy into a veterans hospital, Trapper John, M.D., used the name of the character in a very different medical drama, legally tied more directly to the film than the television series. A proposed Radar continuation did not become a lasting series. The ingredients survived, but the 4077's particular pressure chamber could not simply be relocated. Reunions worked better because the audience wanted memory rather than imitation. Cast members and creators could look back at how the show was made, explain departures, and recover the warmth behind conflicts that low-trust nostalgia channels often inflate into hatred. The continued affection among many participants is less sensational than a secret feud and far more consistent with the work visible on screen. The physical legacy entered the Smithsonian. Costumes, objects, and materials from the series became artifacts of American history, an unusual destination for items built to support a weekly comedy. The collection recognizes that MASH became part of how the United States processed two wars at once: the Korean conflict represented in the story and the Vietnam era present in the room where viewers watched it. What can disappear in a broad history is how often individual episodes rehearse the show's complete argument in miniature. A foolish desire would collide with an emergency. A character would discover that a joke contained a real need. The war would interrupt the story, and then the story would continue because the people had no alternative. Adam's Ribs began with Hawkeye's rebellion against the camp menu and expanded into an elaborate attempt to order barbecue from Chicago. The plan was ridiculous, but the intensity behind it made sense. Food became a stand-in for home, choice, and a life not controlled by army supply. Then casualties arrived at the exact moment the ribs did. The operating room claimed priority, turning a comic obsession into another reminder that personal comfort could be postponed without warning. The incubator built comedy out of a need that should not have been funny. The doctors wanted equipment that could save lives. The supply system could offer pizza ovens, procedure, and explanations more easily than an incubator. Hawkeye and Trapper climbed through layers of authority while the request became more absurd. The joke was not that the equipment was unnecessary. The joke was that the institution had become better at defending its process than serving its purpose. Deal Me Out gathered much of the ensemble around a poker game while crises kept entering the room. Sidney Friedman and intelligence officer Sam Flagg represented two opposite forms of authority. Sidney listened for the truth beneath behavior. Flagg was so committed to secrecy that he became a walking parody of suspicion. A social evening became a revolving stage where every entrance altered the stakes. The late Captain Pierce trapped Hawkeye inside paperwork that had mistakenly declared him dead. At first, the error offered comic possibilities: no pay, no mail, and a bureaucratic identity that had vanished. Then Hawkeye reached his father by telephone and could hear him without being heard. The administrative joke became a rehearsal for death. Hawkeye experienced what it meant for home to receive a version of the world in which he was already gone. Hawkeye removed almost the entire regular ensemble and left the injured surgeon speaking to a Korean family that could not understand his language. He kept talking because he feared losing consciousness. The episode made his defining habit medically necessary. Words were no longer entertainment, seduction, or control. They were a rope he used to remain awake. The formal experiments were surrounded by quieter structural risks. The long john flap passed one warm garment from person to person, turning an object into a map of favors and scarcity. The Army-Navy game trapped the camp beside an unexploded shell while rival services argued over responsibility. The bus removed major characters from the familiar set and forced enemies to cooperate while stranded in danger. The series kept testing how much of its identity belonged to the camp and how much traveled with its people. In Death Takes a Holiday, the medical team tried to keep a dying soldier alive past midnight so his family would not forever associate Christmas with his death. Charles initially treated the effort as sentimentality, then joined the decision to alter the recorded time. The Army measured life through forms and clocks. The doctors sometimes changed those records to protect the living. Winchester's best stories exploited the distance between his social armor and his medical conscience. He could complain about camp conditions, protect his record collection like sacred property, and treat Korea as a personal insult imposed on Boston. But when a patient's future depended on him, class performance often gave way to precision and responsibility. In one story, Charles secretly donated expensive chocolates to an orphanage and became furious when the administrator traded them for basic food. His anger assumed the gift's symbolic meaning mattered most. The explanation, that rice and cabbage would feed the children longer, forced him to recognize that generosity offered on the giver's terms could become vanity. In another, a pianist who had lost the use of one hand made Charles confront what happens when technical excellence and personal identity have become the same thing. Those stories would have been impossible with Frank Burns. That does not make one character better as a piece of comedy. It shows why the series needed a new source of conflict. A longer-running MASH required opponents capable of transformation. including Hawkeye Unquenate. Hawkeye could identify hypocrisy with exhilarating clarity, but certainty was also one of his flaws. Episodes placed him in command and showed that condemning decisions was easier than making them. His refusal to carry a weapon expressed a coherent moral boundary, yet the camp still depended on soldiers and systems he despised. The show did not always challenge him enough, but its strongest stories recognized that righteous anger can become another method of controlling a room. Margaret increasingly challenged that control. She could share Hawkeye's contempt for stupidity without sharing his contempt for the army. Her profession, rank, and ambition were not obstacles she needed to abandon before becoming sympathetic. The nurses exposed the isolation created by her authority and by the distance she maintained from the women under her command. When the distance finally broke, the episode did not erase rank. It allowed Margaret to admit that leadership had cost her belonging. Her engagement and marriage to Donald Penobscot had offered a fantasy of being recognized by the military world she valued. The marriage exposed a different confinement. Becoming an officer's wife threatened to shrink the professional self she had fought to establish. Her divorce therefore mattered beyond romance. It removed both Frank and Donald as the poles around which the writers organized her life. Potter's stability carried its own history. He had served in earlier wars and kept a longer roll call of absent friends. In Old Soldiers, a bottle sent by a dying friend led Potter to gather the camp and explain a private tradition among men who had survived the First World War together. He drank to friends who were now gone. The scene revealed that strength did not come from remaining untouched. It came from having practiced grief for decades. BJ's devotion to Peg and Aaron also contained anger. A letter about a first word, a birthday, or another man helping with a household problem could destabilize him more completely than an officer's threat. Korea was dangerous not only because BJ might die there, it was dangerous because life at home might learn to continue without him. The series allowed that fear to make him jealous, unfair, and occasionally cruel. Love did not automatically make him simple. Sidney Friedman understood all of them because he never treated sanity as a permanent category. People moved toward and away from crisis. Hawkeye's jokes could be insight in one scene and avoidance in the next. BJ's anger, Charles's superiority, Margaret's control, Potter's ritual, and Klinger's schemes were different ways of negotiating powerlessness. The show also had limits it could not solve simply by becoming more serious. Korean characters often received less interiority than the Americans treating them. Early episodes sometimes used language and caricature that later seasons handled more carefully. Yet the best stories recognized the imbalance at the center of the premise. The Americans dreamed of leaving Korea, while Korean families would remain inside the consequences. That accumulated moral and emotional history is why the finale could sustain 2.5 hours. The audience was not only asking whether the war would end, it was asking what each survival strategy had protected, what it had damaged, and whether these people could carry it into ordinary life. The series was not flawless. Its sexual politics could be careless. Some stories carried the limitations of their era. Hawkeye's moral certainty could become exhausting, and the later scripts sometimes announced their themes more loudly than the early episodes did. But the show also changed in public. Margaret became more fully herself. Replacements created new relationships instead of imitating old ones. Supporting characters outgrew their original jokes. The form expanded as the people deepened. That is the complete story of MASH. Not a perfect show preserved in one golden period, but a series that survived by refusing to remain what it had been. It began as a risky adaptation of an unruly film. It nearly disappeared after one season. It became a hit, then killed a beloved commanding officer at the moment he seemed safe. It lost major stars and discovered that different characters could make the ensemble stronger. It replaced a fool with a rival, turned a nickname into a person, let a company clerk grow up, and pushed a half-hour comedy into documentary, real-time, subjective camera, and dreams. And at the end, it returned to the oldest instrument in the show, a joke told because the truth was too painful. Hawkeye finally named what happened on the bus. BJ finally said goodbye without speaking it. The camp disappeared below the helicopter, but the word remained visible. That is why the ending still works. MASH never promised that laughter would defeat war. It promised that laughter could keep people human long enough to find one another, and, if they were fortunate, long enough to make it home. Subscribe to The Long Rewind for complete stories of the television classics that defined the 70s and 80s. And tell us in the comments, Which show deserves the next complete rewind?